thank you all for being here, for taking the time out of your day and out of your evening, and for getting out of bed for that matter. Sometimes it takes a lot of effort just to do that, so thank you for being here. I'd like to say a few words about naturopathic medicine before I really dive into my topic this evening. Naturopathic medicine is a distinct form of healthcare. It's an entire system in and of itself that is based in the philosophy that the body has an inherent wisdom and tendency to self-heal. We naturopathic doctors call this the vis medicatrix naturae, the healing power of nature. Naturopathic medicine is holistic in its orientation, always taking into account the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of each individual. Naturopathic doctors use natural remedies such as whole foods, herbs, specific nutrients, acupuncture, and homeopathy to give the body what it needs, to inspire the patient, and to help remove the obstacles to cure. We are primary care doctors here in the state of California. We are able to diagnose and treat people with a wide variety of health conditions, and we seek to use the least force interventions to achieve the most therapeutic outcomes. Thank you. Welcome to the near future. It's time to go to the doctor. Yet this isn't an appointment for a routine physical or a visit to just any specialist. Today, you are going to see your psychedelic doctor. It's a beautiful morning, and you wake up well rested, having dreamt deeply and peacefully. You start to assemble a bag to take with you, including your list of intentions for today's session. Perhaps an item to place on the altar, or photos of loved ones. You pack a coconut water, your favorite fruit, and an herbal elixir specially formulated to help your system ease into today's session. You contemplate where you are in your healing journey and wonder, what will be the psychedelic medicine of choice today? Perhaps you are a combat veteran, a rape victim, or a displaced refugee struggling with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Perhaps you are an opioid addict or an abuser of tobacco or alcohol, yearning to get sober. Perhaps you are grieving the loss of a parent, a child, a friend, or life partner. Perhaps you are experiencing a debilitating depression or anxiety related to a serious health condition. Or perhaps you want to explore an aspect of your creativity or work on a long-standing engineering problem. Or perhaps you simply want to explore the nature of consciousness itself. Your psychedelic doctor will listen to your desires and concerns. Your psychedelic doctor will help you to examine the goals you have for your life, as well as the challenges that you experience. Your psychedelic doctor will choose the most indicated medicine to help you today and discuss the ways that you can partner together to minimize risks and optimize benefits. Your session may take place in a cozy journey room or outside in nature. Your psychedelic doctor may offer music, aromatherapy, bodywork, or sound healing to support you in your journey today. And your psychedelic doctor will take notes of important themes that arise for you, as well as help you to the restroom or fetch you a blanket. Your psychedelic doctor is a highly skilled guide, trained to help you navigate the terrain you will traverse today in your session with the accompaniment of this sacred technology. Thanks to years of experimentation by courageous pioneers from all walks of life, psychedelic medicines are now legally available, and you are excited to explore their creative and therapeutic potentials. Welcome back to 2017. While
What year was that?
That's the near future. While psychedelic medicines are not yet legal in the United States, current medical research around the world is demonstrating the promise of psychedelic healing and forging new directions for the future of medicine. Clinical trials sponsored by the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, the Hefter Institute, the Beckley Foundation, and the USONA Institute at prestigious institutions such as Johns Hopkins, UCLA, NYU, University of Wisconsin-Madison, Imperial College London, and more, are exploring the therapeutic value of psychedelics with very promising results. These studies are demonstrating safety as well as efficacy for the health conditions being treated. And long-term follow-ups to date are showing lasting benefits. Ayahuasca, ibogaine, psilocybin, ketamine, and MDMA are several of the agents being studied as therapeutic adjuncts for conditions such as PTSD, depression, terminal anxiety, and substance abuse, all of which do not have reliably effective treatments available. Ayahuasca, a brew made from at least 2 Amazonian plants, is showing promise in the treatment of substance abuse. Ibogaine, a derivative of a West African plant, is specifically effective in the treatment of opioid addiction. Ketamine, a synthetic psychoactive pain reliever, is helping people with treatment-resistant depression. MDMA, a semi-synthetic stimulant, often referred to or associated with ecstasy, is offering patients long-term relief from their PTSD. And psilocybin, known to be the active component in many psychoactive mushrooms, is helping to alleviate existential anxiety and depression in patients with a terminal diagnosis, as well as helping people to stop tobacco, cocaine, and alcohol abuse. Participants in these trials are demonstrating relief from debilitating conditions which have previously compromised the quality of their lives. Most psychedelics are inherently non-toxic and non-addictive, and paying attention to several important constructs can increase the potential for a safe and beneficial experience. For example, factors such as one's mindset, preparation for the experience, the setting or container in which the experience occurs, the dosage and quality of the substance, the presence of a guide, and appropriate integration optimize the potential for a safe and beneficial experience and facilitate the incorporation of the insights gained and the material accessed into daily life. Psychedelics are currently being studied for a relatively small number of health conditions and may have utility in supporting many aspects of human health, as well as the health of the planet on which we live. We need this type of help right here, right now. The United States is in a disease crisis which is characterized by high healthcare expenditures, high rates of chronic conditions, many of which are considered preventable, and a burdened system with limited resources, informed by a paradigm of reductionism and mechanistic materialism, whose primary tools are potentially toxic drugs and surgery. In short, while medicine in the US has made huge strides in prolonging life with heroic measures, it has done little to successfully address chronic diseases such as diabetes, cancer, and heart disease, let alone mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, and PTSD. A new form of medicine is needed, one that's based on a holistic foundation of individualized care, utilizing non-toxic remedies, and incorporating the cutting-edge tools of consciousness and transformation such as psychedelics. To illustrate the disease crisis in the US, let's look at some statistics from leading institutions in the United States. The CDC, or Centers for Disease Control, estimated that in 2014, the US spent $2.6 trillion in healthcare expenditures, 38% of which went to hospital visits, 24% to physician services, 6% to nursing care, and 12%, or $297.7 billion, to prescription drugs. In 2014, 12.7% of adults were found to have diabetes, 33.5% had hypertension or high blood pressure, and 37.7% were considered obese. That's a 15% increase in obesity since 1994, so 20 years. Children were found to have a growing epidemic of obesity, with 8.9% of the children aged 2 to 5 years old being obese. That number increasing to 17.5% between 6 and 11-year-olds, and 20.5% between the ages of 12 and 19. In addition, only 20% of adults surveyed met the physical activity guidelines for Americans that recommend at least 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity per week and muscle strengthening activities 2 days per week. The top 5 leading causes of death reported in 2014 were heart disease, cancer, respiratory disease, accidents, and stroke. This data was critiqued by researchers from Johns Hopkins in an article published in the British Medical Journal in May of 2016, where they documented 251,000, or 9.5% of the deaths in the US, as results of medical errors, implicating medical care as the 3rd leading cause of death in the US. The National Institute of Mental Health in 2015 found that 18% of the US adult population reported anxiety, 6.7% suffering from depression, with 16.1 million people in 2015 reporting at least one major depressive episode. 3.5% of the population reported post-traumatic stress disorder. This number is much higher in the veteran population. Researchers from the Department of Veteran Affairs and Baylor College of Medicine estimate a lifetime prevalence of up to 31% of combat-related PTSD in veterans. NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, in 2015 said that alcohol and tobacco abuse combined accounted for over $500 billion in costs related to crime, lost work productivity, and healthcare expenditures. And SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, stated in 2015 that 119 million adults over the age of 20 years old, that's 44.5% of the population, used prescription psychotherapeutic medications, with 18.9 million of them reporting intentionally misusing them. We have an overweight, anxious, and depressed population, struggling with addiction, exercising inadequately, spending lots of money on drugs, and plagued by death of the heart. The US disease crisis is reflective of the planet's ecological crisis. Climate change and environmental toxicity are having devastating effects on the biosphere, evidenced by rapid decline in biodiversity and increased rates of extinction. According to NASA, climate change is real. Carbon dioxide is at its highest in 650,000 years, sustaining an exponential increase since 1950. Exponential meaning that the rate of change gets faster and faster and faster. Global temperature increased 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880, with 9 of the 10 warmest years on record occurring since 2000. Global temperatures are forecasted to rise 2.5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit over the next century. The global average sea level increased 7 inches in the past 100 years, along with acidification of the ocean and melting of sea and land ices. 18 or more scientific associations agree that the main cause of climate change is the human expansion of the greenhouse effect, secondary to liberation of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide from fossil fuel burning, biomass burning, deforestation, decomposition of waste in landfills, and mass utilization of fertilizers in agriculture. The Society of Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry, the World Health Organization, the United Nations Environment Program, and the Environmental Working Group have all turned their attention to the role of climate change and environmental toxicity in the health of humans and animals. Anthony McMichael, an Australian epidemiologist, published multiple articles on the effect of climate change on human health, including increased death rates from heat stroke, decreased availability of food, microbial proliferation, and changes in vector pathogen-host relationships. Unfortunately, the long-term combined effects of climate change and environmental toxicity are unknown and likely underconsidered in healthcare. In 2009, the Environmental Working Group found 232 chemicals in the umbilical cord blood of 10 newborn babies in the United States, including BPA, heavy metals, and dioxins. All of these compounds are known to have serious deleterious health effects, including causing cancer, disrupting endocrine function, impairing brain development and neurological function, and are associated with behavioral abnormalities, infertility, obesity, diabetes, and countless other health conditions. Anthropogenic or human-generated toxins, such as industrial pollutants and pesticides, are now present in the environment at an unprecedented level. And many scientists believe we are moving towards the 6th mass extinction. CIIS professor of cosmology Brian Swim has said, "We are living in a modern culture which extinguishes life and does not have context to imagine extinction. It is as if our global human culture has an incredible blind spot that enables the continual destruction of the environment without any awareness that such destruction is possible, unpredictable, and ultimately self-sabotaging. As we do unto others, we do unto ourselves." As Chief Seattle said in a letter to President Franklin Pierce in 1855, "This we know, the earth does not belong to man. Man belongs to the earth. Whatever befalls the earth, befalls the sons of the earth. Man did not weave the web of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself." As the climate changes and toxins are spewed into the environment, they inevitably end up back in our tissues. For the human body is a microcosmic reflection of the macrocosmic organism Gaia. Perhaps with the assistance of psychedelic medicines, we can awaken to new insights about preserving and promoting the health of humans and the planet alike. Where does the mindset that enables the destruction of the planet and ultimately our own bodies arise from? Richard Louv, author of Last Child in the Woods, suggests that we suffer from nature deficit disorder, that our lack of contact with nature is making us sick, and fosters a mentality which makes it easier to exploit and disregard the natural environment, leading to a degraded and toxic state for the planet and its inhabitants. Perhaps we are deficient in practices of ritual and ceremony, including the conscious use of psychedelics and the exploration of multiple states of consciousness. In a conversation with my mentor, Dr. Jim Sensenig, he asked me, "Why is our culture so afraid of expanded states of consciousness? Every culture has found them at least utilitarian, if not necessary." Editors Roger Walsh and Charlie Grobe state in the book Higher Wisdom, Eminent Elders Explore the Continuing Impact of Psychedelics, "Many of the world's societies are polyphasic, meaning that they actively explore and derive their understanding of reality from multiple states of consciousness, including dreams, drugs, meditation, yoga or trance, in addition to the normal waking state. By contrast, the West has been primarily monophasic, valuing and deriving its view of reality solely from our usual waking state. Perhaps we are estranged from indigenous worldviews, the worldviews that all of our ancestors, somewhere along the way, kept. Views which hold that all beings in the universe are inherently sacred, interrelated, and to be cared for within a complex and reciprocal web of respect and mutuality. Indigenous cultures worldwide, from Siberia to the Amazon, have utilized psychoactive plants and fungi, such as ayahuasca and mushrooms, for millennia, both to facilitate access to information for healing, divination, and community building, as well as to explore the nature of consciousness. Psychoactive plants, fungi, and animal-derived substances have been called psychedelics, a word often interpreted to mean mind manifesting or soul manifesting. Psychedelic was coined by psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond in 1957, born of a conversation with writer and philosopher Aldous Huxley, as they each sought a name for the experience elucidated by LSD. In a letter to Osmond, Huxley wrote, "To make this mundane world sublime, take half a gram fan aerothyme." Fan aerothyme being a term he coined to mean spirit manifesting. Osmond responded, "To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." Other words in common use include entheogen and egodelic. Entheogen, coined by Carl Ruck, scholar of mythology and religion, refers to a substance that generates contact with the divine within. Richard Doyle, author of Darwin's Pharmacy, Sex, Plants, and the Evolution of the Noosphere, has introduced the term egodelic, a psychoactive substance which enables us to perceive ourselves as part of a complex web of relationships that includes not only every one of us, but all of life and ultimately the entire cosmos. Psychedelics, entheogens, and/or egodelics can occasion mystical experiences, enhance our connection with the universe at large, and help us to access holotropic states of consciousness. Holotropic is a term coined by psychiatrist and LSD psychotherapy pioneer Stanislav Grof to describe states of consciousness that orient us towards wholeness of body, mind, and spirit, with potential for facilitating healing on the individual and collective levels. Consider for a moment that the word sacred indicates something that demands or is worthy of reverence. Bill Richards, author of Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics and Religious Experience, states that mystical consciousness is an unspeakably vast, dynamic, magnificent, and profoundly meaningful state of awareness that remains in the memory banks of those who witness it. He goes on to say that all of the great world religions have words that point toward this highly desired state of spiritual awareness, such as samadhi in Hinduism, nirvana in Buddhism, and the beatific vision in Christianity, to name a few. He further elucidates a common core of characteristics of mystical states of consciousness, which reliably include descriptions of unity, transcendence of time and space, intuitive knowledge, sacredness, deeply felt positive mood, and ineffability. In other words, it's really hard to describe. There are two main approaches to legally integrating psychedelics into modern society right now: the path of religion and the path of medicine. In 2006, Roland Griffiths and other researchers at Johns Hopkins and the Council for Spiritual Practices published the results of a clinical trial demonstrating that psilocybin, the active component of magic mushrooms, occasioned mystical states that had substantial personal meaning and spiritual significance, and attributed to the experience sustained positive changes in attitudes and behavior consistent with changes rated by community observers. Not only did study participants report benefit, their families and friends did so as well. The legal religious use of the psychoactive cactus peyote by groups such as the Native American Church and the South American brew ayahuasca by the Santo Daime and the União de Vegetal churches in the US is known to bring about mystical states of consciousness and primary religious experiences, although they do not necessarily result in a spiritual way of being. As Aldous Huxley put it, it goes without saying that this kind of temporary self-transcendence is no guarantee of permanent enlightenment or lasting improvement of conduct. It is a gratuitous grace, which is neither necessary nor sufficient for salvation, but which, if properly used, can be enormously helpful to those who have received it. Despite their value for religious and spiritual purposes, most psychedelics have in fact been placed in Schedule 1 by the DEA, indicating that they have no medical value and have a high potential for toxicity and abuse, all of which are simply untrue. The 1950s, 60s, and 70s were the most fruitful decades of psychedelic research worldwide, with thousands of LSD studies published, demonstrating its benefit and potential as a tool for psychotherapy, while also documenting its effects on metabolism, time perception, and exploring its potency as a tool for addressing addiction. In fact, one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous was a strong advocate of bringing LSD psychotherapy to AA, but it was not quite well received. In 1970, President Nixon introduced the Controlled Substances Act in the United States, rendering psilocybin, mescaline, LSD, and DMT illegal. The act effectively ended all government-sanctioned psychedelic research, and what was once a flood diminished to a trickle, and remained that way for the following 3 decades. Due to a variety of fortuitous factors, serendipity, hope, and lots of persistent, dedicated effort, the US is now celebrating a psychedelic spring, a renaissance, a resurgence of inspiring research in the past 2 decades. In the United States, MDMA and psilocybin are making great advances in FDA-approved clinical trials. All pharmaceutical drugs in development are screened through the following protocol, progressing from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 and potentially phase 4 of clinical trials. In phase 1, researchers test a new drug in a small group of people for the first time to evaluate its safety and determine the safe dosage range and identify any potentially toxic side effects. In phase 2, the drug is given to a larger group of people to see if it is effective for a particular condition and to further evaluate its safety. So currently, MDMA and psilocybin have come through this phase of research. They've demonstrated safety in phase 1 studies, and they have also now demonstrated safety again and efficacy for specific conditions in phase 2 trials. Phase 3, the drug is given to a large group of people to confirm its effectiveness for said therapy, therapeutic intervention, to continue to monitor side effects, to compare it to other commonly used treatments, and to collect information that will continue to allow the drug to be utilized safely. Once a drug passes through phase 3 studies, it's possible that it can either be approved to go to market or that it can be, in the case of psychedelics, rescheduled. So again, right now, psilocybin, MDMA, all the psychedelics pretty much are in Schedule 1, meaning that they're highly illegal, they are thought to have no medical benefit and to be incredibly toxic and have a high potential for toxicity and abuse. Again, MDMA and psilocybin have made it through phase 1 and phase 2 trials with astounding results. And they are progressing forward. And hopefully we will see the rescheduling of those substances and many more so that they will be moved out of Schedule 1 and put into hopefully Schedule 3 or beyond so that we'll be able to access them more. If a drug passes through phase 3 studies and is either approved or rescheduled, then it will persist in a state of phase 4 studies. These are done after the drug has been marketed to continue to gather information about the drug's effect in various populations, as well as any side effects that might be associated with long-term use. In the past 6 months, researchers from MAPS and the Heffter Institute have had very favorable meetings with the FDA. It's been really fantastic to be privy to some of those early conversations where we've gotten some of the first emails here in the CIIS community about the successful meetings that MAPS and Heffter have had with the FDA. Planning is underway to move psilocybin and MDMA into phase 3 clinical trials right now. And there's also hope for expanded access as well. Expanded access, which is also called compassionate use, provides a pathway for patients to gain access to still investigational drugs before the FDA provides full approval. According to MAPS, the hope is that this research will continue to progress and lead to a rescheduling of MDMA so that it may be utilized as a prescription medicine by the year 2021. Welcome to the near future. MDMA, or 3,4-methylene-dioxymethamphetamine, was first synthesized in 1912 by Merck. In 1976, it was introduced to psychedelic chemist and pioneer Alexander Sasha Shulgin by one of his research students. Sasha went on to develop a new synthesis method for MDMA and later introduced the chemical to Leo Zeff, a psychologist in Oakland, California. Leo used small doses of the substance in his practice as an aid to talk therapy and introduced it to hundreds of psychologists across the nation. Sasha went on to develop over 200 novel psychedelic compounds right here in Lafayette, California, just on the other side of the East Bay Hills, at his home lab, and tested them on himself and his wife, Anne Shulgin, and a very close group of friends who were willing to experiment. He and Anne went on to publish 2 books, PCAL and TCAL, which stand for phenethylamines I have known and loved, and tryptamines I have known and loved. Phenethylamines and tryptamines are 2 of the main groups of psychoactive substances. There are others, but many of the classic psychedelics fall into those 2 broad chemical categories. Sasha continued to express his love and interest for chemistry and psychedelics up until his death just about 2.5 years ago, and I was very fortunate to spend his last Easter with him in 2014. was a very bright, witty, brilliant man with a very sweet soul. And my last potent memory of him was kneeling down by his side. And at this point, he was in and out of states of lucidity and sometimes slightly verbal and often not very verbally engaging. So I knelt down by his side at Easter, and I just wanted to watch what he was watching. And I saw this wonderful excitement in his eyes as he watched these two little girls run around chasing Easter candy or something, and he was just so fascinated and inspired by their little young lives. And I just had my hand on his leg, and I just said, thank you so much, and I just cried. He gave us a lot of really wonderful gifts. Leo Zeff, who was introduced to MDMA by Sasha Shulkin, and then introduced it to countless other therapists, ultimately around the whole world, went on to work with all sorts of numerous psychedelics in a therapeutic context, and truly inspired an entire world of underground psychedelic-assisted therapy. There's a fabulous book called The Secret Chief Revealed that talks about his life and gives a very personal experience of what he was like. Dr. Michael Mithofer, a psychiatrist in South Carolina, and his wife Annie conducted the first recent randomized controlled pilot study on the safety and efficacy of MDMA for patients with chronic treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. Their initial results, published in 2011, reported that 83% of the active treatment group experienced clinical benefit. The results of their long-term follow-up study, published in 2012, reported that the majority of the subjects with previously severe PTSD who were unresponsive to existing treatments had relief from their symptoms that persisted over time, and that no one reported harm from participating in the study. Some participants had been living with PTSD for over 20 years, and now they had their lives back. MDMA research is specifically important and promising in the veteran population, a population so tragically plagued with PTSD, depression, and high suicide rates. The Department of Veteran Affairs research indicates that the rate of suicide in the veteran population has surpassed the number of deaths on the battlefield, with an average of 20 veterans committing suicide every day. There were 7,400 veteran suicides in 2014 alone. There are currently 2 first-line treatments for PTSD that are endorsed by the VA. These are 2 forms of psychotherapy: cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure therapy. However, a review in 2015 of almost 1,000 participants in randomized clinical trials utilizing these 2 forms of treatment reported that although some study participants reported a decrease in their symptoms, 2/3 of them still met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. 2/3 still met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. That's not an effective enough therapy. It's inadequate. Despite being first-line treatments, they're simply not effective a majority of the time. And there really is a great need for more effective treatment for veterans who are suffering in this way. And MDMA is a promising option. Anthony, Iraq war veteran and study participant, said about his MDMA therapy, "The military does a great job of turning you into a soldier, of teaching you how to control your reactions. And it is hard to turn those habits off. The feeling I got was nothing at all for 45 minutes, and then really bad anxiety. And I was fighting it at first. And then I don't know how to put it exactly. I felt okay and messed up at the same time. Clear. It was almost like I could go into any thought I wanted and fix it. I'm a different person because of it. Dr. Mithofer has said about MDMA therapy, it's not that people just have a blissed out experience and feel great about the world. A lot of the time it's revisiting the trauma, and it's a painful, difficult experience. But the MDMA seems to make it possible for them to do it effectively. Donna Kilgore, rape victim, PTSD patient, and MDMA-assisted psychotherapy study participant, reports in reference to her experience. It meant the world to me to be able to look at the fear, to look at the shame. When I got out of that session, I felt 100 pounds lighter. MDMA gave me the ability not to fear fear. Researcher Marcela Otalora says, with MDMA, you not only see your fear, but you trust yourself to go past it. It allows you to access a place in your mind that's compassionate and full of love. You might have abandoned that place, but it never abandoned you. I had the pleasure of dining and speaking with Dr. Michael Mithofer about his passion for MDMA research after the second psychedelic conference in Oakland in 2013. It was really fantastic to just witness his excitement. Again, a sense of childlike wonder that I saw in Sasha's eyes as he talked about the benefits that he observed in his patients and the wonderful lasting results that people were reporting at that point in the research. After that dinner and upon returning to the conference hotel, I was walking to the exhibit hall to make sure that my team on the Healing Arts crew had sufficiently cleaned up all of our gear and pieced themselves back together. And while I was walking down the hall, I saw two very clearly disabled men walking towards me. They stopped, and one gentleman asked me about the conference, telling me how excited he was to learn about this doctor from South Carolina, sharing that they were veterans and expressing his hope that MDMA might help with his PTSD. I found myself poised at a point in the universe where one man's hunger met another man's passion. As I looked at them, I thought, this could be anyone's brother, anyone's son or father, and my heart cracked open. Through this man's sharing of his vulnerability was born an intimacy between us, and therein blossomed the flower of empathy. I propose that this process of coursing the trajectory from vulnerability to intimacy and ultimately empathy may be one of the therapeutic mechanisms of psychedelic experiences. Research professor Brené Brown states that vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. While sitting with our vulnerability, we are able to cultivate intimacy with ourselves, with others, and with the whole universe. This intimacy can lead to a recognition of self as other and other as self. And what naturally derives is empathy and a desire to care for others as we would like to be cared for. From this heightened place of empathy, we begin a process of healing on the microcosmic level of our individual beings, which has the potential to influence the macrocosm. The personal work we do to acknowledge, be with, and release fears, to remove obstacles to love's presence, to open to connection with ourselves, each other, and the universe, can bring about transformation for each of us, for the planet, and for all of her inhabitants. There are, of course, other possible explanations for the therapeutic mechanisms of psychedelics. For example, it is commonly accepted in the research community that most psychedelics stimulate a serotonin receptor in the brain known as 5-HT2A. Yet they also stimulate a wide variety of other brain receptors, the complex, unique constellation of which may account for their similar and diverse therapeutic potentials and effects. Neuroscientist and psychedelic researcher at the Royal Imperial College London, Robin Carhart-Harris, has conducted extensive fMRI studies which have monitored the brain function of study participants under the influence of psilocybin and LSD. He and his team have found that psychedelics increase communication and connectivity across the entire brain, and that they reduce activity in the default mode network. The default mode network, as Carhart-Harris describes, is a part of the brain which we think of as the best candidate that we have for the biological underpinnings of the sense of self. Furthermore, it is thought that when the DMN, or default mode network, is overactive, it can produce rigid patterns of thought and contribute to conditions like depression. If psychedelics help to quiet this part of the brain, then perhaps they allow more fluid patterns of thought, open-mindedness, and curiosity to arise and thrive. Psilocybin research, spearheaded by the Hefter Institute and the USONA Institute in the United States, has shown amazing results for the treatment of existential anxiety associated with terminal illness, as well as in the treatment of tobacco, cocaine, and alcohol abuse. As Johns Hopkins University researcher Roland Griffith states, a life-threatening cancer diagnosis can be psychologically challenging, with anxiety and depression as very common symptoms. People with this kind of existential anxiety often feel hopeless and are worried about the meaning of life and what happens upon death. Griffiths and the Johns Hopkins group reported that psilocybin decreased clinician and patient-rated depressed mood, anxiety, and death anxiety, while increasing the quality of life, life meaning, and optimism. This is research that was recently published at the end of last year, and that demonstrated that 6 months after the final treatment session, about 80% of the participants continue to show clinically significant decreases in depressed mood and anxiety, with about 60% showing symptom remission into the normal range. 2/3 of the participants reported the experience as being one of the top 5 meaningful experiences of their lives, and about 70% reported the experiences as one of the top 5 spiritually significant lifetime events. Not only did the study participants experience significant reduction in their symptoms of depression and anxiety, they were able to be more present with their family and friends for the remainder of their time on the planet. Estelyn Walkoff, cancer patient and NYU study participant, shares a bit about her experience. The worst pain and the worst fear and the worst anxiety turned into something that has opened, which is the most precious thing that I have ever known, a sense of connectedness that runs through all of us. The fear, as it decreased, transformed itself into this open heart, which was able to receive these lessons. She goes on to say, "The other day while I was meditating, I had this feeling coming over me, and the thought was of compassion for myself. That touches me the most. That's such a gift, to have that moment of grace, that I'm okay. I'm okay. You're okay. We're okay. I'm okay. I am so grateful and touched and shocked, and it has lasted, and I think it will bring more changes. If in the future this could be used with all patients under the direction of mentors, shamans, psychotherapists, it would make for a much happier world." While most of the clinical research taking place is using relatively moderate doses of psychedelics. An area that has recently gained interest in the press is microdosing, taking very small, sub-perceptual amounts of a psychedelic. As lawyer and writer Ayelet Waldman has recently shared publicly about her experimentation with microdoses of LSD in hopes of relieving long-standing depression, I had a really good day. The first in as long as I could remember. It was like this heavy, dark weight lifted off my shoulders. Jim Fadiman, avid supporter of microdosing and author of the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, was one of the early researchers at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Menlo Park. He and Myron Stolaroff and other researchers conducted lots of research in the early to mid-60s and the use of psychedelics for creativity and problem solving. He and his colleagues were elated by the results of their participants in improving their scores on esteemed creativity tests and in experiencing significant breakthroughs with their professional problems. Fadiman refers to the work of John Markoff, a science reporter for the New York Times, who interviewed Steve Jobs and documented the impact that psychedelics had for Jobs and others on the development of the personal computer. Markoff wrote a fun book called What the Dormouse Said, if you want to learn more about that. At his 100th birthday celebration in 2006, avid microdoser Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who synthesized LSD-25, said, "LSD wanted to tell me something. It gave me an inner joy, an open-mindedness, a gratefulness, open eyes, and an internal sensitivity for the miracles of creation." The possibilities for where psychedelics can guide us in our healing and creativity are endless. Of particular interest to me is the holistic approach to optimizing psychedelic experiences, taking into account the support we can derive from preparation and integration practices, such as thinking about our diet, ideally eating an organic, live, whole foods diet, utilizing herbs in the forms of teas and tonics, specific nutritional supplements, aromatherapy, sound healing, and more. I offer the following questions for your consideration. What circumstances and practices sustain the use of psychedelics in a way that is healthy and beneficial for participants and the community? How can we develop and caretake a wisdom culture that will allow for the incorporation of these tools into our individual and communal healthcare practices and traditions? I believe it is possible to reimagine a way of being in this world, which allows us to see and honor our embeddedness within the web of creation, to treat all beings with reverence, to care for others in the earth as we would like to be cared for, and to open ourselves to the miracles which await us when we avail ourselves to them. I believe that psychedelics are sacred technology that can catalyze this process, and that the promise of psychedelic healing will revolutionize the future of medicine. Thank you. So we'll take a few questions, and the request is that you get a mic so that we can all hear you. And we're going to ask them to come up. Is that? Yeah. Okay. So if you'd like to ask a question, please come towards the front of the room and towards a microphone.
Just make a line over here. cited PTSD and noted that it didn't have any reliable treatments for it at the current time, specifically referencing CPT and PET, which are the approved treatments by the VA. I just wonder though, there is a very substantial, safe, proven, and extremely reliable form of treatment for PTSD, which you didn't mention, EMDR.
Thank you.
And I wonder how can we balance, I just wonder what the studies are showing that make psychedelic treatment for PTSD so overwhelming that it should be considered in lieu of a very effective, readily available, and heavily tested treatment such as EMDR.
Wonderful, thank you for bringing that up. I did overlook that. EMDR has shown benefit for sure for lots of trauma, not only PTSD, but other types of trauma as well. So thank you for bringing that up, because that was in my research, and a simple error of omission, I did leave that out.
What is it?
Eye movement desensitization, rapid reprocessing, thank you. It's a technique in which you're basically trying to stimulate both sides of the brain to help reprocess information of a traumatic nature, is one concise attempt at a definition.
Like a mushroom.
And so where I want to go with that is, so EMDR, yes, has shown benefit and certainly doesn't require anyone to potentially subject themselves to a therapy that we're still showing safety and efficacy for. But what I find to be challenging with any sort of long-term pharmacological intervention or therapeutic intervention is that it requires that people go often or stay on a drug for a period of time. I'm not 100% up to date on what the time frame is of EMDR and its efficacy. If you have something to add on that, I'd love to hear that in terms of its time frame. But what these studies are showing is that these participants are getting 1, 2, maybe 3 sessions of MDMA assisted psychotherapy, and that's it. And then they're having, of course, some psychotherapeutic sessions around those to help prepare and integrate the experience. But it seems to potentially accelerate the process and have persistent benefits even years out from the conclusion of the study participation. So it's not that people need to have an ongoing prescription or therapeutic relationship necessarily, although of course we can all benefit from therapeutic relationships and ongoing EMDR for that matter. Did that help to answer? Okay, thank you. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Natalie.
It's not quite on.
Is that on? Wow. Natalie, thank you for your intelligence and your compassion and the various perspectives that you bring to this topic. I'm also curious about a form of treatment that psychedelics can bring to PTSD, though I'm thinking more in terms of pre-traumatic stress disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And you spoke a bit about the sort of connection between microcosmic human health and macrocosmic planetary health. And I just wonder, thinking maybe slightly longer term than what the medicalization of psychedelics is going to allow for, in terms of using something like MDMA for people who haven't yet experienced wartime trauma. If politicians, people working in the Pentagon, etc., were to experience these states of consciousness, what sort of collective cultural transformation do you envision that might be possible? And what sort of avenues, maybe this is the spiritual avenue towards psychedelics starting to permeate the culture as opposed to the medicalization approach. Do you have hope for that in 10, 20 years? Or what do you envision as being possible on that front? Pre-traumatic stress disorder treatment.
I love it. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, Dr. Siegel. That's great. So let me start by saying that I'm highlighting these two methods because they happen to be the primary directions forward in a society that needs those languages spoken to them. Okay, so religion is really hard to argue with. People get all in a bunch if you start to mess with their religion and their spiritual beliefs. So there are institutions built into the government to protect people, the Religious Freedom Act, for example, right? So it's a pathway. It's not the only one, but it's a pathway that's effective. Medicalization, not necessarily the answer either, but also providing a pathway that speaks a language to institutions like the FDA. They don't really care at all what people do in the room with these researchers. This is like verbatim out of the mouth of the researchers. They don't give a darn if we hug them, if we tuck them in with blankies, if we have flowers in the room, if we do or don't give them coconut water. They don't care. They want to know, is the MDMA safe and are you keeping it under lock and key? That's all they care about. That's all. So it's a narrow frame, for sure. So how do we expand those frames? Well, on one hand, I think continuing to walk these agendas forward through those two pathways is beneficial collectively. Short of like spiking the water supply, I'm not really sure that we're gonna get a bunch of people to sign up. We might. Some people of their own accord want to evolve themselves and want to look at their inner ecology, if you will, and tend to that. Some people are not interested in that, as evidenced by the current state of affairs in the US. There's a lot of people that are paralyzed by fear. Paralyzed by fear. And here we have, the leading cause of death is heart disease. This like central organ to our body and our being, this organ thought to be of emotion and to be essentially like the main filter for information in some schools of thought beyond this one. We're dying there. So what do we do? This is an ongoing question. I think one of the ways we can continue to be efficacious in moving these agendas forward is to support the research happening around religion and medicine, because they're just certain skeleton keys that are all ultimately unlocking the same big door, and that we need to continue to do our own work, to educate ourselves, to specifically learn how to utilize these tools responsibly. As Ayelet, the woman who was experimenting with microdosing, said in an interview I was listening to with her, she said, I'm aware of my privilege. I'm aware of my privilege. I'm a white lawyer. Somebody sent this to me in the mail. That's available to me. It's not available to everybody. So how do we expand our interest and capacity and invitation for diversity in this conversation too? That's one piece of it. What responsibility do each of us take, not only to tend that personal ecology, but to bring it out into the world and to educate our parents, our friends, our loved ones about the responsible use of these tools? And where do we look for guidance? Yes, we have these models of religion and these models of medicine that are promoting certain beneficial things, but I feel like we really need to also look to the indigenous context, where these substances and practices have been in use for thousands and thousands of years. And we need to ask for their blessing and their guidance to share their insight and wisdom and knowledge with us, so that we can honorably just so that we can honorably engage that and move forward in creating our own wisdom cultures. Yeah. Thanks, Matthew. Hi.
Hi. Two questions. One is, what do you know about any research that's being done with people that suffer from degenerative brain issues and dementia? and if it's beneficial for them. There's been stuff that's shown that marijuana helps with Parkinson's and things like that. Are they doing any kind of research on that? And also, if people say, how do people get into these like trials and these studies? Not that I'm not asking for myself, but just out of curiosity, since it is Schedule 1, how do people get into that?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not aware of any studies specifically of related to specifically brain degeneration or dementia. If someone is aware of that, let me know. Speak up. Just give me 1 second. So I want to complete the thought on it. One issue that I see that would arise out of that is informed consent. Part of participating in any sort of research is that you have to be able to demonstrate informed consent, that you were advised of the potential benefits and risks of any particular treatment or intervention, and that you have consented willfully. So if someone is in a state of cognitive decline, I could see where that would be an ethical, issue in terms of getting research moving forward. Probably cannabis, and I would think definitely mushrooms and psilocybin and LSD would be helpful. Did you know can you come to the mic and just tell us? Can you come to the mic so that we can all hear you? Thanks, Joshua. This is specifically into the cognitive piece?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and thank you for that. Response is very responsible to mention that people with dementia cannot decide for themselves, and that's a big difficulty for research in that. But I've been working with people with dementia for a long time, and I've had a good chance to compare people with dementia who never had any experience with psychedelic drugs and those who had actually experience with psychedelic drugs. And we cannot say anything about the benefit of psychedelic drugs for the brain to avoid to get ill. But what I can say is that everybody who had experience with psychedelic drugs can deal with dementia much better. And also me in the dialogue, I can really tune into working in the dialogue with dementia much better with the understanding of psychedelic experience. And that might encourage you, or also I hope one day it's going to be more easy for people with dementia to have this experience, because even then in the state of dementia it's very helpful.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. It's a really difficult, nobody wants to be the one that says you can or can't be in this or have this experience, and yet from the research perspective, there are ethical standards that are expected to be adhered to for sure, and that would be a big one with that population. To address the other piece of your question, one of the best ways to find out about what's happening in the research studies is to go to the websites of MAPS and Hefter, and they'll have information there about any open enrollments that are going on. Yeah. Back over here. Hi, Jimmy.
Hi, Natalie. I'm really interested in talking more about the trauma piece and how the inclusion criteria for the PTSD studies are so specific and ruled out a lot of different types of complex trauma, and also the participants across the board were very white. And I'm wondering what you think about psychedelics' potential to address issues of entrenched social injustice and the types of ongoing trauma like racism, transphobia, ableism, those types of traumas.
Yes, thank you. Gosh, I mean, really who doesn't need it in the water supply, but it's just a microdose. So I think, again, it always starts with a willingness. Like, do we have the willingness to look first in at what are the prejudices, the biases, the fears, the beliefs that I'm holding, right? Like starting on home ground, home territory. And I think that certainly, working with psychedelics can help to allow us to look at, essentially in my experience, anytime that we have a prejudice or a projection, it's stemming from a fear. And that may or may not be true, that's my experience. It's stemming from a fear. And so if we're willing to inquire around what is underneath that, what is the foundation that's holding that fear up, it often allows for that foundation to be disassembled and transformed. The woman who I quoted that was in the NYU cancer study also said in part of her interview that she brought specific music to her session and that she was listening to gospel music, and in her terms, a beautiful black woman was singing, and I suddenly was transported to the time of different experiences of oppression in her, potentially in her life. And she said that she had this like massive just opening of grief and remorse and yet identification with what that trauma was like. So in a sense, perhaps considering certain types of exposure therapy while under the influence of psychedelics could be really therapeutic and therapeutic in their potential, as well as coming in with intentions to look at our biases and our fears, as well as, so not only on the individual level, but what can be accomplished in group process. Oh my God, right? If we can have a community, a facilitated community conversation, perhaps with the assistance of something like MDMA, that's probably gonna change politics, revolutionize healthcare, transform traumas on all these different levels. So I think we need to keep thinking like outside the box, big picture. Again, right now we've got these two paths, religion and medicine, that are swimming, leading this particular way in these particular grooves that are important and helpful and necessary right now. But let's think outside the box, like let's get big with it, because there are countless other populations that need help and need all of us as allies. We all need to be allies. Does that help? Yeah, thanks, Jay.
So thank you for speaking with us tonight. And how do you, as a doctor, advocating treatment that is still unfortunately largely illegal, navigate that with your patients or your clients? How do you advocate them getting access to these eye-opening experiences? And then how do you sort of balance that with the value of recreational use, and its long-term or lasting effects, and the structure needed in order to have those positive long-term effects?
Thank you. That's a great one. So I'll start by saying I do not advocate the illegal use of any illicit substances in the US. Okay. There are many patients in my practice who do choose to have experiences in legal contexts. Many of them travel out of the country and or are part of some of the religious institutions here in the US that do allow them to have legal experiences. So I offer in my care integration support. So I encourage people, if they disclose whether it's ceremonial, therapeutic, or recreational use of these tools, I encourage them to share about that if they want to, and I make myself available to help them basically unpack the insights that they might have gained or the material that they might have accessed so that they can incorporate it into their life in a meaningful way in the form of conversation. There are nutritional practices and herbs and supplements that have lots of anecdotal evidence, reports for their benefit in helping people prepare for experiences. People can find this information online and access my biochemical knowledge, and I can say, oh yes, that may or may not be how that pathway works. It's definitely a tricky line, because again, I don't advocate any illegal things. However, people are having experiences, and it's important that they be able to talk to a doctor about it. There are some substances that do have potentially toxic effects. There are questionable qualities of substances available and or doses. So people benefit from being able to be transparent with their care providers about this. So, yeah. Hi.
Hi, Natalie. Thank you for speaking. I have a question in regards to the medical aspect. I'm a nurse, and I am interested in this for personal reasons. However, I see a huge benefit from the medical side as well. So I'm actually transforming my career and going a different pathway towards this research. And I know that the access is limited to get in and do research and kind of become part of the community that helps this process along. So do you have any advice or information kind of in that regard?
Yeah, 3 things that come to mind right away are that here at CIIS, we have a certificate for psychedelic therapy and research. There are many members of the first cohort here in the room with us tonight. I was very blessed to be a member of that group as well. And in about 2.5 weeks, the next cohort of students will be coming in. And so that is a certificate program that you could look into.
I applied.
You applied? Okay, great. So that's one.
Congratulations to those who made it.
Okay. There were a lot of applicants, so yeah. The other piece is continuing to come to events like this. So I'll put a plug in for ERIE, which stands for Entheogenic Research, Integration, and Education. ERIE is a nonprofit organization that a few friends and I founded 5 years ago. And we were very interested in continuing the entheogenic polylog, as we like to call it, and who bring in all diverse perspectives on all things entheogenic. And so we host monthly events, integration circles, have countless things online on our YouTube channel. That's a wonderful resource, and coming to those events really will mushroom into wonderful things. And last but not least, Psychedelic Science is right around the corner. Okay, Psychedelic Science is a conference that is sponsored by MAPS and Hefter and the Council on Spiritual Practices and Beckley Foundation, and pretty much every psychedelic research organization in the world will be present April 19th to 25th in Oakland, California. I'll be there hosting the Healing Arts space, so please come say hello. Go to that, even if it's just to hang out in the exhibit hall and not go to talks. You'll meet great people. Yeah. You're welcome. Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
I was just wondering if there had been any research done about possible benefits or effects on the use of psychedelic substances with people, probably particularly adults who still struggle with ADD or ADHD in their everyday lives.
I'm not aware of any. There's some very interesting research going on with autistic adults who experience social anxiety. So the sphere of interest and expansive research is continuing to open up. I'm not aware of any studies with that though. Okay, yeah, I don't, if anybody else is, please speak up. Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
My question for you is, as an herbalist,
Yay.
what's the importance to you of keeping plant psychedelics such as psilocybin in their original form, as we've seen this surge of cannabis modification? I'm curious to know how you see that playing out.
Great question, thank you. So we have this concept, right, that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, right? That if we separate something into different constituents and then reassemble them doesn't mean that we're going to get the whole shebang again, right? This is very important when it comes to foods, for example, right? We have a lot of frankenfoods. If you go to the generic grocery store and stroll around, there's all these weird food-like substances, as Michael Pollan would call them. Food-like substances. They might have things that we recognize that were once food and now are frankenfood. The same thing can happen, certainly, with herbs and with psychedelics. So one of the challenges that we have in terms of research is FDA, again, doesn't give a darn if you're hugging your clients. They want to know, are you keeping that GMP certified 99.9% pure psilocybin, it's only one compound, under lock and key and administering a metered dose? Because they are, so again, this is back to that reductionist, mechanistic, materialistic paradigm that's informing the masses, which is how we get to where we are, that is saying, well, we have to just really limit it to one variable. This is the gold standard in modern reductionist science, is we limit all the variables as much as possible and then change only one. So that we can say, because we're trying to essentially suggest causality, although we never really can, but we're looking at potentially a cause and effect. Okay, we gave the psilocybin, they had an experience, their anxiety scores went down. Okay, they don't really even care about the experience. They don't care about the phenomenology or what two people saw. They just care anxiety scores down in that model, right? Luckily, we have researchers with lots of heart that say, we really want to hug you. We really care that you saw God, or your grandmother came to visit you, or you were visited by flying serpents. We want to know. They care, okay? So with that said, yes, it's possible that we lose something when we go to isolated compounds and extracts, whether that's at the level of an herb or whether that's at the level of a psychedelic. But for the purposes of the research as it stands right now in the US, that's how we have to play the game. That doesn't mean that in time we won't be able to say, hey, that was a nice, we did a lot of research with psilocybin, it gets rescheduled, and with that get rescheduled mushrooms and other compounds, and then there will be the opportunity to utilize these things in a different way than is legally available now. The other piece I'll say about that is, who really knows? So Gordon Wasson, who was basically a self-trained ethnomycologist, traveled to northern Oaxaca back in the early 1950s to study with the Mazatec people in Huautla de Jimenez. This is the birthplace of Maria Sabina and many other beautiful elders there that are keeping the mushroom tradition alive and well. He had heard about this mushroom cult in the Mexican mountains, and he went down there and he found Maria Sabina, and over several years convinced her to do a session with him. And so he was be-mushroomed, as he put it, and had a really wonderful, powerful experience, came back to the US, shared about it. It was eventually written up in Life magazine, right? Life magazine, and really kind of catalyzed the emergence of psychedelic mushrooms into the consciousness of the US and the whole planet at a different level. It's believed that they have been in use by various groups of people all over the world for a long time, but due to oppressive forces such as inquisitions, they got suppressed. But because Huautla de Jimenez is a very isolated portion of northern Oaxaca, it was one of those places where the indigenous tradition was kept alive. So, over time, Gordon Wasson develops this relationship with Maria Sabina. Eventually, he sends some mushrooms off to Albert Hofmann in Switzerland, who over time identifies psilocybin as one of these, well, this compound stands out and it might be the psychoactive one. Okay, great. Albert Hofmann synthesizes psilocybin, sends it back to Huautla de Jimenez with Gordon Wasson in a capsule. He gives it to Maria Sabina and she says, yeah, that's it. So, I don't know. Is it that simple? Is it just a molecule? Is it that she lived in a context where that was possible? Where those types of experiences were available to her? Is that what conditioned her to be available to it in a pill form? I don't know. I've had the pleasure of spending some time in Huautla de Jimenez a couple of years ago and studying with an elder there, Julieta Casimiro, who is carrying on this tradition of working with the mushrooms in a sacred way. And it's a whole other experience of how a psychedelic agent is incorporated into the culture. It's like this in many cultures around the world where it's part of the cultural heritage and the tradition there. It's not that big of a deal, and it is a big deal all at the same time, right? So the church in the center of town is painted with mushrooms, and the priests eat mushrooms, and like, whoa, wait, the Catholic priest eats the mushrooms, and there's mushrooms on the church, and the whole thing is, it's just, it's syncretized into something new. Yeah. We have another question over here.
So I've been diagnosed as ADD since I was in first grade, so the other guy's question really piqued my interest. My uncle has Asperger's, and I have also suffered with like social anxiety all my life. So it was really interesting in what you said that research was with social anxiety and psychedelics.
Yeah, so the research that's currently being done is with a wonderful doctor. Her name is Alicia Danforth, and she's out of UCLA in LA, obviously in LA, Harbor UCLA, and she's doing studies with adults who identify as autistic and identify as having social anxiety, and she has completed one study to date, and there's a second one in process right now, where autistic adults who identify as having social anxiety are being given MDMA in a therapeutic session and therapeutic setting, and are having wonderful benefits, experiencing a reduction in their social anxiety, which is opening them up to other ways of being present and relating in the world. So that's the one that I'm aware of is MDMA-assisted therapy.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and you can look at the MAPS website, which is maps.org, maps.org, and they'll have more information about that there.
What was the name of the doctor again?
Her name is Alicia Danforth. Yeah, she's awesome. And today's International Women's Day, so just give her a little shout out. Thank you. Yeah.
Last question.
Last question. Hi.
Hello. What are your thoughts about MDA and the differences between MDMA and MDA? Personally, I believe MDA is more spiritual and it has more potent qualities of healing. What has it been in your experience, talking to patients? And a second question, maybe something about underground research. I've been reading about a book about cosmic serpent, which talks about ayahuasca and the snake, cosmic snake. Wanted to pick your brain on that.
Let's start there, and then I'll go back to MD and MDMA. What do you specifically want to pick my brain about in terms of the cosmic serpent?
How real
Go ahead.
Like the relationship with DNA, and we heal ourselves at the core by adjusting our DNA structure in certain ways. I haven't had personal experiences with the latter. I don't know about it, but he definitely talks about it a lot. And
Sure.
You see the title of the book,
Yep.
too?
So, what's your name?
My name is Sina.
Sina. So what Sina is referring to is a book by an author named Jeremy Narby, and it is called The Cosmic Serpent. And Jeremy Narby is an anthropologist and definitely an advocate for the conscious exploration of psychedelics and really honoring indigenous wisdom traditions. And so it's been quite a while since I read that book, but I loved it. And what some of the takeaways for me are that what he demonstrated in there and has been demonstrated in other anthropological works and anecdotal reports and whatnot is that there are sometimes particular themes that emerge with the use of certain types of psychedelics in particular contexts. That's not 100% the case, but that seems to be part of it. So for example, in the case of ayahuasca, if you look at the phenomenology of ayahuasca, many people report seeing serpents. That's one of the common themes, is a serpentine quality of the imagery, okay? Some people report being devoured by serpents or being dismembered in some way, shape, or form by a serpentine energy, and then reconfigured and reborn, perhaps. So my understanding of what he was sharing in that book was that my understanding is he was highlighting, or what I remember, or what I'm interpreting at this point, was that he was highlighting these two different pathways of knowing that essentially arrived at the same or similar place, right? So here we have the shamans of the Amazon who've been drinking ayahuasca for millions of years in a cultural context where, I mean, you know, big serpents live there, okay? That's different than if you're living in Siberia or on Hawaii, right? But in those cultural contexts, those shamans were seeing imagery that led them to this, if you would like to say, serpentine or helical structure at the core of our essence. Well, if you live in a place where serpents are part of your daily experience, potentially, that might be embedded in your cosmology, right? Whereas Watson and Crick, who are attributed with discovering the helical structure of DNA, which, by the way, they say was assisted with LSD. They were in a very different culture, right? Where it was like reducing things to their smaller parts, so that was the pathway. I think ultimately what he indicated is that we got to a similar place of understanding through different pathways. So I think a lot of what he has had to say in there is probably really accurate, and it's really interesting and exciting and fun to think about. Did that help with that piece?
It did.
Okay, there's probably more we could say. Maybe we talk in person a little bit more.
I love that.
Yeah. In regards to the question about MDA and MDMA, so MDA is synthetically one step away or behind. It's really one molecule away from what MDMA is. So MDMA stands for 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, and MDA stands for 3,4-methylene dioxyamphetamine. And so we take out a methyl group and from MDMA and we get MDA. So it's convenient that the letter lines up with the group, right? Take the M out, it's a methyl, bam, we have this other molecule. They are reported to have different subjective effects for sure. MDA, according to people who've shared about their experiences with me, report that MDA tends to be more visually psychedelic for them. For some, imparts different types of imagery and experiences of insights and accessing different types of material. Because it is amphetamine versus methamphetamine, it's less stimulating on the body. Methamphetamine is a massive stimulant, and MDMA is essentially a methamphetamine analog, which is just a notch more stimulating to the body and may have potentially more toxic effects or more impact downstream. So that's one thing to think about, is kind of like what are the impacts on the body and how might that alter or shape someone's experience. MDMA is reported to be more empathic from a lot of people that have shared with me about their experiences. Whereas MDA still does have some of that empathic quality, but that's really the signature of MDMA, is that it is thought of as being an empathogen and being very heart-centered in its experience. So I think both could probably be very efficacious in helping people to connect and look at things in their lives. But that's my understanding of some of the difference. I think they probably both have a lot of utility, and maybe MDA was used in the early research, you know, or not even the research, but Leo Zeff and like that whole crew, I mean, they're using everything. 5-MeO, DMT, toad venom, ketamine, LSD, DPT, I mean, they real rock stars. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, thank you.